This was earlier this week. High Court Chief Justice Susan Coffin announces early retirement. Got it at the bottom. Another COVID perpetrator flees the scene. All right, let's get into this one. It's a strange one because she was due to leave in January next year, and she's leaving just 2 months earlier on November 5th. Now, there's no reason given in this article. All they do is take the opportunity to say how great she was. There must be some legal reason or something that happened during COVID, or something that if she stays until January, she's liable maybe for something. I haven't researched that, and I'm not going to, but or either that or something big is going to happen in December this year, who knows, and she's been told, well, you're not around for that, we're going to be putting somebody else in. I don't know, but it's just odd that she would call it time. 2 months, I think she's been there for 6 years. Like, well, why not just go full term? In the work I'll be putting out on Substack, I've divided people up into being COVID perpetrators, COVID enablers, such as the media presenters and that. But these are the top 4 perpetrators. I mean, there's lots that had big roles to play, certainly Greg Hunt, but these were the 4 that were in positions to, well, Holton was the coordinator, but the other 3, their authorised signature was required to do really key functions to impose a devastation on us Australians. Now, Jane Holton's number 1 because she was at event 201 and she was tied up with Bill Gates and she was flying backwards and forwards to coordinate all of the different entities they needed to work in order to pull this thing off. She did an excellent job, but not for us, against us, but you've got to say she did a good job. I've got the Governor-General as number 2. They try and pass this off as a ceremonial role, as, you know, he's a retired army guy and just, you know, he's respected and he'll be there on Anzac Day and all that. But I'm not going to go into it now. I'm going to do an expose on each of these. But the position of Governor-General has some really unique special powers that really shouldn't be used, but they were under the Biosecurity Act. I'll point out that this David Hurley character, I mean, this is one of the chances. There's only been 2 military governor-generals, and he was the second one, and he was deployed on operations with the US military. He was in Africa, and Major General Fruin, the Operation COVID Shield coordinator, he had served with American military in the Middle East. I mean, what are the chances, the exact time that, and there are indications that this whole thing emerged, certainly came out of America, but it was a military operation right from the get-go. I'm going to do a bit more of a deeper dive into that, but there are certainly indications and this kind of backs it up, that you've got 2 key positions that were embedded and indoctrinated into the US military because when they're overseas on deployment, the US military are the senior force. So if you've got 2 nations with the same rank, the US rank is taken to be a higher authority. That's how it works. Someone has to be higher. You can't have, the same rank. Someone is senior. So these guys and these are military guys. Their mindset is they just want to please authority. They'll do anything to anyone that's above them, they'll please them. So again, I'll just reiterate, what are the chances that these 2 characters ended up right in the key positions throughout COVID? Now, I've got Keifel as number 3 in the big 4 list of COVID perpetrators. Yeah, I spelt that correctly with the I. In that her position was used to quash any legal challenges from the very top. They needed to take control of the courts straight away. I'll expand on her role in a little while. And number 4 is Philip Lowe. He transferred $400 billion. Him and Josh Frydenberg worked together in that Frydenberg had to sign off on the Inscribed Stock Act 1913, in order that he could transfer that money, because he couldn't do it without Frydenberg. But I've got him there as number 4, and they kicked it off on the 19th of March 2020, one day after the emergency had been declared. How did a non-medical agency like the RBA get involved in COVID intervention in the biggest way. That was the biggest hit we took. Sure, there was a lot of, Aspen Medical got billions, and all Nine Entertainment and all of these media companies, they got hundreds of millions of dollars. But the biggest hit was the $400 billion transferred to the banks through their exchange settlements accounts through the RBA. And the financial effects are just ramping up now because, he made that statement that interest rates weren't going to go up until after 2024, and they've gone up 4.5% already. That's kind of part two of the 1-2 punch they've done on young aspirational Australians trying to get into the housing market. Now, of course, there is the jab, and there are a lot of people involved in that, but it's these four that enabled this emergency to even happen with all the damage that they've done. So that's why they're number 4. All right, let's get into COVY. This was a crowning contribution back in June 2020, so they got in really early to just let everyone know there's no avenue that way to get out of this COVID thing through the courts. And she did it with this case here. Tourism operators lose High Court bid to access Queensland government documents over border closure. And the case was about border closures hurting businesses. Look, it was hurting small business. None of the big businesses were part of any court action because they got told, you don't need to be. And I put out some videos on Mayor T back in the day of how SeaWorld and a few of the other big operators got hundreds of millions of dollars. Just, they got approached. Here you go, here's your money. And it had some of them had some animals, and they did the emotional animals need to be looked after. Like they could have given them maybe 10 million and then made them lose all of the profits. But the same as that Scape rental in Queensland, where they hired a whole building to stop any of these large operators from being affected. It was targeted at us. We know that. So in a preliminary response lodged to the High Court statement, the Queensland government said they do not admit to the claim, border closures affecting their business. The Health Minister negates that opening salvo of no admission by making somewhat a partial admission by saying, well, look, it wasn't the sole reason for the hardship, citing, international airline shutdowns. When you think about it, that should have been the argument to keep the borders open. Look, they're already being hurt. Let's keep them open to minimise the damage, but I'm sure they were exacerbating it. The Gold Coast Bulletin, the local rag, they actually reported on data shows shocking impact of closures. Tourism and Events Queensland, if you go to their website, they actually get their stats from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. They published information. It's a PDF they put out, and the Gold Coast Regional Snapshot from 2013-2021 clearly shows a drop. This graphic here shows on the left-hand side the drop-off on the Gold Coast down to, looks like around 50%. And this is from 2013-2021. So the international visitors only comprise 0.2%. The majority is the local, but then 33% is interstate business. That's a big impact. So visitor numbers dropped 51%, which means, 32% you couldn't go there if you were from another state. And that should have been around, say, 70%, but obviously the intrastate within Queensland also restricted travel, so it dropped right down to 51%. That's half your earnings. But when you think about it, if locals are going there to stay at the accommodation, they're not going to go on charter boats like we highlighted earlier. One of the businesses that was part of the court action, that's more likely from interstate travellers to use those kinds of businesses. So here we go. Visitor numbers were down 51%, and visitor expenditure, this is how much they spent, was down 43.7%, which means it dropped down to 2.8 billion, which means they lost about 2.4 billion. Now, obviously, any compensation for the small operators wasn't enough to cover their costs. Like what happened here in New South Wales, there were really, really complicated criteria. There was a bookshop that closed down. I got talking to her, and she didn't reach a few. She was quite elderly. I think she didn't mind retiring anyway, but she closed down around that time. But the lawsuit was about opening the borders, not about compensation. So the Queensland government's defence their claim of making no emissions. Well, there's no possibility the Queensland government did not foresee the drop. They'd have all these statistics here, and they would have known exactly how much. They probably calculated it, the damage they were going to do. So I mentioned quite a few times before in previous videos, the whole thing was done on modelling, and because they only said it suggested. She's not actually making a claim here. Now, the actual number of deaths, this was the actual statistics. This was evidence. Statistics is evidence. You can document it and show, okay, this is the effects right now. And even the modelling didn't state that it was going to drop it by, from 30,000 down to 6, which would have to be extrapolated from hospitals, because that's what the modelling was done on, hospitalisations, not even deaths. So it's not unreasonable for the tourism operators to go, okay, well, let's just show what evidence you've got. And of course, COVY played her part, and it's got there. They lost a High Court bid to get copies of the documents the Chief Health Officer relied upon to shut the border. I'll just read this out word for word, I want to be particular here. So, Chief Justice COVY, in the most audacious decision in Australian legal history, refused to issue a subpoena to the Queensland Government for evidence in the greatest event in the history of Australia because, get this, it would result in time being lost. Well, how much time would have been lost? And what was the damage done to the case or to the court or to any public facility in that time being lost? Well, of course, that was never mentioned further. And she said the evidence was a subsidiary issue. Should focus on constitutional arguments. Well, the first step is to get the evidence in, and then once it's shown it's not justified, then it goes back to, I'll get in a sec how it goes back to the Constitution, but I'll also read this bit out. So, stating an application for the evidence required by the plaintiffs was subsidiary was without doubt wrong, which is why, I mean, it's just unconventional. It'd be just probably, if any judge did that in any court case, they'd shut the whole thing down and have the person take it for a mental assessment. Now, that's the key part of the job, the evidence. Are you saying we can't have evidence in a court now? I mean, that's how wrong it was, which is why she heard the application, not one of the other High Court justices. Her, so as a Chief High Court Justice, there's no avenue for a higher appeal, so they stopped it in its tracks right there, and that flowed on to, like, Clive Palmer. You know, I think he was part of what was going on. Not 100% sure, but, you know, he's a billionaire, and he was playing his part as the buffoon. But that shut down all challenges as at June 2020, which just left a clear path, knowing full well you could never get COVID into a court, relating to damage done by the emergency. So, hypothetically speaking, what if COVY had opened the case notes and agreed to force the Queensland Government to say, hey, I'm interested to know what's going on, which is ordinarily in every other case that's ever been heard before, and what's going to be heard afterwards. Well, that's always going to be the case. That's the evidence. What evidence would have been disclosed?
Of course, we heard this from her Deputy Premier yesterday.
Oh, well, I think the figures speak for themselves. Queensland and Queenslanders have done incredibly well. And, you know, all of those days, we had to make really tough decisions. And tough decisions where there wasn't necessarily an evidence base, there wasn't necessarily a right or wrong answer. But we took the health advice, we made those difficult decisions.
Well, the thing about that is, just listen again to part of that.
We had to make really tough decisions. And tough decisions where there wasn't necessarily an evidence base.
Tough decisions where there wasn't evidence base.
No, they're absolutely nothing. In the same way, Chet Hazard turned up at a couple of New South Wales budget estimates hearings with no documents. All it was verbal. There was no documentary evidence supporting COVID intervention in response to a virus anywhere. You could do an FOI. I'm pretty sure it just doesn't exist. I think they had meetings and no minutes were taken, and they just verbally discussed it with Jane Holton being there, and then the scripts that they read out, which would obviously be put through the shredder, they memorised them, went out and just spoke. And there's, in the same way that the virus didn't appear in the master species list of the International Taxonomy Commission, it's not there. SARS-CoV-2 isn't in the master species list. There's no document. There's absolutely nothing to see anywhere that you can get into a court to this day. This whole gain of function Wuhan stuff, talking about as though there was a virus that escaped from a lab and all this sort of bullshit. I'm sure he did transfer the money, all part of the producing the evidence. Oh yeah, that there actually was a deadly virus, but none of the statistics, if you go through all of and they even told you, there was an article in the ABC which said you can't tell the difference between the flu and this. It was just a flu virus. All they did was just get a genetic sequence of a virus that was somewhere and then gave it a new name, didn't put it in a master species list, in other words, not documented, and any of the discussion they had about it was never documented, and they've gotten away with the whole thing based on that. Lockdowns, smashing people's heads into the ground. it was all just based on dandelion spores. It could just blow away in the wind. There was nothing there. It's just I've got to do a whole Substack article from start to finish on all of this. All right, this is the last presentation part. I'll finish up pretty quick. I was going to make this one short, but I had a lot to say here. I wanted to put it into context and just give a real broad overview as to how important Keifel's role was in this. Because, look, I've got here, like, so Keifel was ordered. She was doing what she was told through Jane Holton to block the application, and even the case might have, right from the get-go, they could have been encouraged. They have handlers, and they maybe in a law society or somewhere, to coax these unwitting Gold Coast operators who are hurting. We should do it. So I've probably got into the court through manipulation in that way. I don't think the charter boat guy was in on it. He would have just been a bit of a passenger thinking, oh yeah, that sounds good. So they got him in there, and the whole thing was, so Keifel ordered to block the application. Otherwise, disclosure there was no evidence of a medical emergency would have circled back to invalidate the Governor-General's COVID emergency declaration and the 7 extensions way back in June. She'd have said, well, we've got nothing. Okay, well, that would have opened the door for high court appeals from everyday Australians. What the hell's going on? If it got advertised and, or reported on in mainstream media. So, I can't emphasise her role. That's why I've done a bit of a longer video on her. She's number 3. I've got to do the Governor-General and also the RBA. I've got a big deep dive on the TFF, the Term Funding Facility. Now that was a big rip-off, but the QE was the bigger rip-off. And I've got a big money trail up on that as well, and Guy DeBell and a few of the perpetrators. Now, I've doing a lot of work on this. I've got a few personal issues at the moment that I'm just going to talk about right now, if you don't mind listening. No, not Robinson Crusoe in that regard, but my time's sort of taken up with things as well, but I'm getting to them. So it took a while to do this video. So, all right, that's it for this one. So my future plans, actually, my next video I'll talk about my future plans. All right, that's it for this one.